So my name is Ollie Kenchington, and like Adrian, I'm an X-Rite Colorati, and act as an ambassador for them and their products. Done various talks for them. We were at IBC together last year, which was fun. And today they have asked me to run through some video tips. Lighting an interview is going to be our main theme for this first 1 hour slot. And like Adrian, we're going to have a 15-minute break and then a second 1 hour talk where I will move from production to post-production. I have been, I run a film production company. In fact, it's slightly odd for me because my film production company is filming the event today that I'm talking at, and it's very weird flicking back and forth between directing that and doing the talk, and it's very odd, a new one on me. But my film production company specializes in predominantly corporate film. A quick show of hands, who is running their own film company or acts as a one-man band or is part of a bigger company, an agency maybe, or a production company, who are working specifically in video? Yes, I thought so. So it's mainly photographers here today. Of the photographers then, those of you that are here, I'm presuming you're not just hanging around. You could have run away at lunchtime. So I'm guessing you've hung around to hear me speak because you're interested in video and adding it on as possibly a new skill. And this is something that has been happening a lot for good 4 or 5 years now. This kind of movement between disciplines. There's been a huge influx of photographers into the video space, into the film space, and it's great. It's actually a really positive step, and it's something that I did as well, actually a long time ago. For a lot of people, the Canon 5D Mark II marked the shift. It was kind of, a hugely popular, still is, a hugely popular stills camera that people had, they were using for stills, and suddenly they could use it for video, and it was a very simple step into that world. Not always as simple as you might think starting out. It's a whole new world in many respects. But I actually did something very similar. I started out studying photography at both college and university some 18, 19 years ago now. And very quickly, actually, I was only doing stills for probably about 3 or 4 years before I got my hands on a video camera, and I just couldn't put it down. I mean, I kind of wholeheartedly jumped ship and actually do very little stills these days. But I had the benefit of all of that stills education. So, all of the Ansel Adams and Walter Benjamins and all of that kind of theory and art, fine art and photography education was in place and gave me a fantastic grounding to then sort of disappear up this new path for filmmaking. And I've been involved in filmmaking ever since. So my main area of speciality really, although I've been operating camera longer than anything else, is in post-production, and we'll look at color grading in my second session. But I have been operating camera for a very long time. I've been lighting for a very long time. And I'm hoping to impart hopefully some new information to you today about just basically around this general idea of a simple interview setup. Interviews form a major part of all of my productions. In the corporate world, there's often that narrative, almost exclusively really, that narrative comes through some kind of CEO or customer story. That narrative comes from that dialogue. It is the foundation of pretty much all of the film work that I'm producing. And then you have this sort of lovely opportunity to get creative with what we refer to as the B-roll over the top. So it's a really nice thing for me, and it often splits across multiple days. So you might spend a whole day or two shooting interviews and then follow up with another day or two shooting B-roll and switching modes and getting into this more creative mode where we're moving the camera in interesting ways. And we get to be far more stylistic. But what's interesting, actually, as I sat there watching Adrian talk, is I found myself sort of having these flashbacks back to, if you'll forgive the pun, back to the days of me doing stills and that relishing that opportunity to be so stylistic. I mean, most things about stills revolve around this stylistic, creative use of light. It's not often in stills that you get given a brief to make something look kind of sort of slightly dynamic, but not too dynamic, please. And it actually comes to life when you really punch things in and use lights to get creative. And I must say I was getting quite jealous because I do miss that ability, because for most interviews, we actually have ourselves in a slightly more constrained environment. The brief and the style and what people expect to see when they're seeing an interview is actually quite different. Although, of course, there are always exceptions. Generally speaking, if you were to do an interview as stylistically as we saw Adrian doing, there'd have to be some incredibly strong narrative motivation for that strong look. And typically that isn't there. Typically, actually, particularly in my world, in corporates, you want something that's kind of glossy but kind of reserved. There's that journalistic style that kind of pervades a lot of interviews. And so I guess the setup that we're going to go through here is in some ways not quite as exciting, which is a shame. But although it doesn't look quite so dramatic, it can, and so it's fantastic to have those skill sets there. But there's certain other things that we can do. And film, as I say, is such a different discipline. We have so many different opportunities in some regards for what we can do, particularly when it comes to movement of the camera, which could fill a whole day on itself. That I want to run through some of the things that I would do in a typical interview lighting situation. What I would do in terms of audio, I mean, that's the kicker, I think, for a lot of people that have come or are planning from moving from stills to video. The two big sticking points for those people are camera movement, which is something they've never really had to think about before, and audio, which even long-established videographers don't think enough about audio. So that can often be a sticking point as well. So we'll talk a little bit about mic placement, about levels, what we're trying to achieve, and hopefully come out of it with an interview that looks good and will form that solid platform for us to build our edit on the top of, if this was a real shoot and we were going on from there. So Amber has left and her twin sister has stepped in, who's wearing a completely different dress, different lipstick and everything. And we're going to, you're getting a live feed from my camera. There you go, that proves it. This is Sony FS5, so I use this for a lot of my corporate work. It's nice and small, capable of spitting out 4K up to 60 frames per second if I'm recording it with my Atomos recorder. But just like Adrian, we need to start from a point of sort of, if you like, the hardware calibration side. The calibration, the color management starts before we hit record. So one of the things that I've just kind of loosely rested on here for now is using X-Rite's i1 Pro probe, which you can see up close and demoed in more detail at the back of the room in the break. But what I'm doing here is I'm just showing that there is a bespoke piece of software that X-Rite and Atomos created together, which will allow you to calibrate their monitor recorders. The Atomos monitor recorders, if you haven't used them before, are incredibly popular because they are, on the one hand, incredibly high quality 10-bit high-resolution displays. They're often ultra-bright as well, or have HDR features that allow you to monitor and record for high dynamic range imagery. But at the same time, they're recorders, and that allows you to bypass the internal recording on your camera and get much higher data rates, often higher bit rates if your camera supports output at that level. And in fact, one of the reasons I use this particular camera is you have the option to output, you need to pay for a little upgrade, which is a bit cheeky, but you can pay to get a RAW upgrade for this camera. So this camera would be typically on a shoot for me spitting out a 12-bit signal over the SDI at 4K at 60 frames per second, and that would be being recorded either, most commonly for me, in 10-bit ProRes. But actually, there was an update to this just a few weeks ago, which means you can, in fact, now capture in 12-bit RAW, Cinema DNG RAW. So incredibly flexible piece of equipment that comes with me on every shoot. And what I do before every shoot is stick one of these on and make sure that that software has run the calibration. Yeah. It's called Atomos, A-T-O-M-O-S. So we don't have, there's no representatives of Atomos here today, are there? But you can ask me and a lot of the guys here know an awful lot about their products because of the relationship they have with the calibration mechanism that they've put in place. So that would be something I would do the night before a job. So, you know, charging batteries, formatting cards, calibrating my monitors that I'm going to be using on set. Because like it or lump it, and we'll talk more about scopes and some of the things that we can look at in post, at the end of the day, we are animals that go on our gut instinct. And the ability to look at a monitor and judge based on what you see in front of you, the look of what you're recording, is an incredibly difficult urge to get away from, and isn't something that you should shy away from. Even if you've got all the scopes in the world on set to tell you about your exposure and your color and your saturation, ultimately you want to be able to just look at something and go, yeah, that feels right, that looks really good. And it's that calibration that gives you that ability to just glance and go, that's what we're looking for. So it's something that would be done as part of my prep for any shoot. Once that's done, the next stage then is making sure that what I'm recording into the camera is accurate, and that's where the charts come in. And so Amber will be using the chart in the same way I would every single interview I ever shoot. I promise you I've not sort of done anything different here. There's no kind of element of doing it because it makes a better demo. This is genuinely, I'm approaching this as if it was just any other shoot for any other interview. So just in the same way that we were talking about, or Adrian was talking about using backlights and adding separation, I'm actually going to start with my backlight. You can leave that down for now. You can hold fire for that one, because I'm just going to set my lights. I've roughly got my composition the way I want it. We're doing this as an interview, so Amber's going to be pretending that there's someone here interviewing her. So this is her eye line. There are sort of generally two camps that you'd fall into with interviews, either a piece to camera, where the camera would be framed centrally and Amber would be looking straight down the lens. It's a very tricky one to pull off, actually. It takes real expertise and practice to be able to hold your eye line at an inanimate object straight down the lens. What we're going to go for is a slightly more traditional off-axis. Amber's going to be looking over here, and that will give us a larger amount of space in front of her, known as looking room. So this big space here is our looking room. It's where the viewer imagines themselves to be, putting them in the perspective of the interviewer, having that chat directly. And it gives us our looking room, which becomes quite important later on when we talk about setting our key. So my composition is roughly in the right place. What I always like to do is I like to get my backlight done first. What I've got here is one of Rotolight's Neo fixtures. These are very small battery-powered lights. They can be run off the mains as well, but they're incredibly easy and portable and run off batteries, as I said, so you can kind of put them into any situation. They are particularly useful, actually, in this. We've got a little handheld grip on here. If you're not entirely certain what it is you're going for, they are quite useful for actually moving around your subject and kind of pre-lighting almost. So getting a feel for where you think you might want your lights to be. And you can see, obviously, with the big projector here, I can actually get some pretty good feedback straight away of where this backlight might work best. If I'm too sidey, so this is verging on a kicker, I can start to spill a little bit of light onto Amber's cheeks, and if you've got good cheekbones, that can be really very good at pulling a crisp edge and creating a sense of depth. But generally speaking, I tend to start up, diffused, so there's quite a lot of heavy diffusion. These front plastic parts pull away, and you can drop in little gels. In the same way that Adrian was using the CTO and CTB gels, you can get those for these. You can also get straw and minus green and various different ones that you can drop in. So I've got quite a heavy diffusion on there at the moment. But they're so small and portable, you can just move around and light your subject and get that feedback instantly. It's actually one of the reasons why when I do still do stills work, I actually light stills with continuous lights now. And I hear an awful lot of photographers increasingly starting to move towards continuous light. So quite the opposite of what we had before, where we were getting by with no modeling, essentially lighting stills from a kind of a permanently modeling continuous light source. And it's something I think I've found myself doing more and more because I spend so much time shooting video. I'm just kind of, my head is completely out of the whole flash world now, although it used to be many years ago. So my backlight, I'm flying out behind my subject on a boom arm, and I'm just simply using a heavy-duty stand with a knuckle on there. So we've just got a simple Avenger grip that I can use to fly this out. I hate the fact that these buttons are so hard to find when you can't see them. There we go. And that gets my backlight up and behind and out of the shot because, of course, we don't want our stands and lights in our frame. So by using a simple boom arm like this, we can achieve that. Let me move this out of the way for a second. So that separation is there. Hang on, let me stick that like that. There we go. That separation is there, and it helps us create that sense of depth. Adrian touched on this before, but I teach a couple of different universities, and it's one of the most common questions I get when I'm talking about lighting with the students is, surely you just sort of turn all your lights, point them at your subject, and there you go. But you have to understand that pretty much all these cameras these days can shoot in almost complete darkness. There's a camera over here we're using. This is a Sony A7S over here. It's just out the wings, you can't see it, that we're using as part of our production. One of the reasons we've used it is because it's so good in low light. You can shoot, there's been really nice pieces actually made in shot just using moonlight. So illumination isn't about exposing. It's about adding shadow. You're adding in those lights to create those shadow areas to sculpt your subject. And the reason that's so important is because ultimately we're viewing this work, whether it's film or stills, we're viewing it in a two-dimensional medium. So you're looking at it on a flat projected image right now. It's appearing on a flat screen there. It will ultimately be viewed on a flat phone or a flat tablet or a flat computer or a TV or whatever it might be. These are two-dimensional planes where we're trying to create the illusion of depth, because the whole purpose of this is to create something that draws our audience in and makes them feel like they're there, makes them feel like they're participating in this narrative, this drama, whatever it might be. And the most successful films, they do that. They achieve that by bringing you in. And one of the simplest ways that you can start to achieve that immersion for the viewer is to fool them that it is a three-dimensional world that they are viewing. Now, I've got two young kids, one's 3 and one's 7, and even my 3-year-old, if I were to draw a circle, she'd be able to say, "Dad, that's a circle." But if I were to shade one side of that circle, she would be able to say, she'd probably say ball rather than sphere, but she would understand that that shading was me communicating to her that this two-dimensional shape I've just drawn is in fact representative of a three-dimensional object. She wouldn't ever say that. That would be really kind of like a sort of, no, it'd be too much. But we understand that that's what's happening. We are using a very basic, fundamental tool to convey that this circle, that's still a circle after I've added the shading, is in fact representative of a sphere. And that's what we're doing here. We're creating with the backlight a highlight edge and a roll-off around the subject, which is essentially creating that graduation, that tonality that denotes that this is a three-dimensional object within a three-dimensional scene. So our backlight, for me, is the most important one, and it's why I tend to start with it, because it's going to give that expression of depth that I'm looking for. It's not for me, even until quite far down the line, it's not for me about illuminating the subject to much level. As soon as you're outside or you're competing with other light sources, then actually that is kind of a bit more front and center, because you're thinking about how can I balance the light I've got here. But in a situation like this where we're completely, or more or less completely isolated, we can start to think just about that depth first and foremost. So we're lucky in a sense. Amber's blonde hair works really nicely for this. When you shoot people with very deep black hair that's not really very reflective, it doesn't look anywhere near as punchy so quickly, and you have to sort of slightly think outside the box. And I've also specifically asked Amber to wear a light-coloured dress for me as well, because again, you can see on the shoulders there how it's picking up really nice and easily. Now, I know I've been in run-and-gun situations. Corporates often end up being a bit kind of, oh, hang on, you can just interview a different person in a different place at a different time. Is that all right? It happens more often than I wish it would. So there are certain things out of our control, but I'm a huge proponent of taking the time and applying some of the principles that you would use in shooting a big feature or a TV show to any level of production you're doing. So that pre-production, that planning, it took one sentence in an email last week to communicate to Amber about what I wanted her to wear, because I knew it would look the best on screen. There's no reason why that can't be applied to any real production that you might find yourself doing. And it's something that I think is overlooked that level of planning, that level of thought about how am I going to pick up colors or the reflectance of objects or things that can help me with my image. So that's a very basic example of how that's been thought ahead, planned for, and is now paying dividends because it works really nicely. A couple of things to be aware of with the backlight. You don't want to come across too far, because if you get any light coming too far forwards, it will start to catch the front of the nose, and that will give a kind of a big, shiny, bright Rudolph nose to your subject. So you'll notice I'm a little bit further back, but I'm toppy enough to make sure that the light's falling down around the shoulders. As I move this around, you will see this happening. It's quite difficult for me to see this at the same time, but as I move this around, you will hopefully see, as it comes into, there you go, this is what we're not looking for. And if I come back too much, then we can end up missing the hair altogether, and it ends up sort of not quite working. If I feel like it's a little too hot, which can be a danger with blonde hair because it's highly reflective, I can either diffuse it further, or I can simply raise it up a little bit more to just slightly soften some of the areas. These lights, of course, are dimmable. They're color tunable as well. So you've got a lot of flexibility there to kind of get the look that you're going for. So far, so good. We have our backlight in place. The next thing I'm going to think about here is my key. And what I'm using for my key is, this is a Rotolight Anova. This is their main sort of high-end pro fixture. It's very powerful, and there's a whole range of different accessories that can help modify the light as you're working with it. So essentially all of Rotolight's lights are a circular distribution of LEDs, but you can augment them and work with them in different ways. So this is a simple egg crate, which I'm using to, in the same way that Adrian was with his flash head, I'm using it to direct the light, allow less spill to other areas where I might not want it. So it's kind of directing the light, but it's also allowing the quality of the light behind it to come through. So behind this, I've actually got a softbox, which is diffusing the light, and that will create a soft light that will create softer shadows. Typically with, as I touched on a moment ago, typically with interviews, there is an established sort of journalistic style that one would expect to see from certainly most corporates. Of course, it can vary off once you get into drama. We're in much more creative territory. But for the type of work that I'm doing day in, day out, your subject wants to be lit in a flattering light. And when you've got a soft light, it obviously softens down the shadows. And so any skin imperfections, any kind of crow's feet, anything like that will be softened as well, and it becomes a much more flattering light for them. Now, we don't have any of those things today, thankfully, but nonetheless, we're still going to use a nice soft light, and we're just going to have a look at how it reacts to, let's turn that right down, how that reacts to Amber's skin. So we have, you'll notice the light elevated and pointing down. This is the most kind of common setup. We're about sort of 30 to 40 degrees off from the camera. We're above our subject and we're angled down. And this produces a very flattering, naturalistic look. If you think where the sun is, when we're out in the sunshine, it's above us always. I guess at sunset, it's going to be slightly less angled, but for our general experience of people and illumination, we tend to always refer back to nature in the way that we perceive things in the real world. And so by having it elevated and angled down, I'm creating essentially a little miniature sun and creating a more flattering kind of look, and it works with all kinds of other things as well. So for example, one of the dangers that we have when we're lighting interviews is the nose shadow. The nose shadow is a dangerous thing. Amber, if you just look here for me, you can see the nose shadow is quite close for a start because the light is a little further away. But most importantly, it's coming down here. The worst thing that you can do, and I'll do it for you now so you can see what it looks like, is if I drop this down, the nose shadow, in fact, is already doing it, but if I angled it up a bit more, you'd see it even more. It starts to head off across the cheek, and you get this big nose shadow sort of smearing across the face, one of the huge benefits of having it elevated is it enables you to send that shadow down the smile lines that we all have, across here, and it actually hides it. Now, the softening of the fixture is helping. In fact, I would often go even softer than, and we're slightly limited with the accessories we've got today, but I would often go even softer than this, so you almost had no suggestion of a shadow at all. But importantly, it's heading down in this direction, so it's going to allow us to hide the nose shadow in plain sight, if that makes sense. It creates a more pleasing look. It also accentuates that angle of the cheekbones, and if we get it just right, and Amber, you're going to have to just sort of pick a point and stare at it for a moment here, because I'm going to slightly move this around a bit. If we change to a slightly more oblique angle, that's a little better. You can see as we've moved this round, the nose shadow has got longer and longer, and so now it's kind of seamlessly merging in down here, picking up in with this shadow, and what we're left with is this classic Rembrandt triangle underneath the opposite eye, which is creating that sort of classic portrait look that is often desirable for this type of commercial work. I always fear when I'm doing this kind of talk that it's like I'm really advocating boring, run-of-the-mill imagery. I mean, obviously there are some huge things that you can do to really mix this up, but as I said, you've got to be led by the narrative. You've got to be led by often your client as well, and you've got to produce something that's what they're kind of expecting to see to a certain extent. So it's why people get so excited about working in drama, because you really can just push things in all kinds of different ways. But for the commercial and corporate work that I'm doing, this kind of classic look with the classic Rembrandt triangle, nice soft nose shadow going down the smile lines, it enables me to create an image that is instantly acceptable and palatable to my reserved corporate clients. And I have clients like Apple, I have clients like Google, which is sometimes difficult. I've actually left Google and gone straight to Apple for meetings before, and it feels wrong. But American Express, Barclays, several large international companies. And if you start pushing things around too much that don't, there's no narrative sort of need for that, then they're not going to get excited and go, oh, wow, you've really pushed the boat out here. They're going to want this kind of standard look. Now, I'm really happy with that, and this is where I slightly always feel a bit kind of disingenuous with this, because we've got another light here, which I do want to talk about, because it's a fantastic new light that Rotolight have just released, and I'm going to demonstrate it in terms of a fill. But actually, I find that in most environments, short of a black box, you don't need a fill. If you're careful about the way you light, you can often pick up a couple of sort of bonus points. So with this setup at the moment, Amber, if you wouldn't mind just sort of looking here for a sec. With this setup at the moment, I'm actually even getting a little bit of an eye light off the key as well. So I'm killing 2 or 3 birds with one stone here. But it might be that this is too dramatic for me. In fact, if I just adjust the exposure a bit so that it's a little bit more obvious. Let me just stop down a bit. And turn this up a bit. I can get more and more dramatic as I balance that out. Nudge the temperature, sorry. That's interesting. It's suddenly gone very green. So I can start to balance out as I brighten my light and stop down. You can see it's getting more and more dynamic. I'm getting deeper and deeper shadow. And yeah, now I'm probably at the point where I do need a fill. But if you're intelligent with the level of lighting, and it's often quite low. I mean, these lights go really bright. I've just boosted it up, and I'm now at 10%. So before I was at more like 3%. So you can see that we don't need a huge amount of light to model our subject. But what it does give us the ability to do is to play with how dynamic the contrast is. So we're now getting more and more dynamic. I quite like this look. I think even with your slightly more kind of staid corporate clients, they start to appreciate that slightly kind of dynamic contrast. It's where things are kind of heavily backlit and coloured and all that kind of stuff that they start to depart from your look. So just to show what I can achieve with my, let's put things down here, what I can achieve with my fill. I'm just going to place this here, so we're kind of at the opposite side now to our key, and I can just use this just to fill in a little bit of that shadow. So what this gives me the ability to do is to juggle my exposure and think about, and I'll come on to this in a second, think about the pros and cons for the different settings that I'm using in the camera, and balancing that off with how dynamic the image is ending up looking. So here I've just added just a tiny, tiny bit of fill. It's, those of you at the front can see this is at 1% at the moment. So I'm just lightening up that shadow side. And what we do is we think in terms of ratios. And those ratios apply from left to right across your subject, but also from your subject to your background. So this is quite dynamic. I could probably brighten up a bit more. Let's do a sort of a classic 2:1. And this is where light meters are very useful, because I can actually take readings from each side of the face and check the f-stop, check that it is a stop difference between the two. So I can actually get this kind of classic 2:1 ratio where the shadow side is half as bright as the key side. The fill side is half as bright. And you can see it's a very classic, very attractive, acceptable image that you would see, particularly in journalism. It's funny, as you kind of move across the Atlantic, the sort of American look is much brighter overall and even lower contrast ratio between each side. I think we tend to have slightly more dynamic imagery on this side of the Atlantic, but we certainly can mimic that more. If I keep the right knob being turned, there we go. We can certainly kind of brighten that up. That's a slightly more kind of American-looking level of contrast across the face, and we can start, as we start to bring that down, we start to get more and more dynamic, and we can look at different interpretations of that. And so what you want to do is you always want to come back to motivation. What's motivating my lighting? So for example, if you are doing let's say that you're shooting some interviews with, I don't know, someone who's in prison. So you're just like a gritty documentary about prison riots. Who knows? I'm making it up. And you're shooting an inmate. And you can then afford to make this really dynamic, because you can use that edgy looking contrast to convey to the viewer something about the narrative. And in fact, interestingly, on a compositional point of view, you can also do other unusual things. So for example, Amber, if you just look here for a moment, if this was a classic interview, this would be like this. But what about if we deliberately isolate? It's slightly difficult because of I can come in and I can push this side. And I've actually got Amber now looking into the side of frame. Now this is classically wrong. In terms of what you should do, this is not right. So Amber's now looking into the edge of the frame, which for any corporate would be, a real own goal, because she looks trapped by the framing. And so that could work really well with my narrative if I'm making a gritty documentary about prisoners. But if I'm not, then what's my motivation for it? And in fact, I see this done, it's happening a lot more actually. It's interesting, you have these different kind of styles and these different sort of fads that come and go. You see it a lot with graphic design and stills as well. And this is something I'm seeing happening a lot actually. And sometimes it's done just because, hey, it looks a bit different, but more often than not it's done because people just don't realize and they've just framed it wrong. Another classic one is a piece to camera, where Amber would be looking straight down the lens, but it's framed on the thirds. So again, it's not what you should do, but is there a motivation for it? Is there a reason for it? Does it give some kind of sense of loss, maybe? Maybe we're talking to someone who has lost a partner. I've seen it used very effectively there, where essentially it's the wrong framing for a piece to camera, but it creates a void next to them where if it was a two-shot, you would have someone. So it comes down to that motivation. What's making you feel a certain way, or what you're trying to tell the audience without telling the audience. But back to our boring old corporate framing. Talking of framing, I'm using a very straightforward medium close-up. So a medium close-up is from chest to top of head. A close-up would be from jaw to top of head. A mid-shot or medium shot would be from waist to top of head, and a wide shot would be right down to the feet and top of head. And what you'll notice in each of those is the top of the framing doesn't change an awful lot. It sort of slightly creeps away as you go through those, but it's mainly the bottom of the shot that's changing. And I feel like too often I see people, I guess they get kind of excited by the possibilities of having that sort of, that opportunity to essentially be quite intimate with the subject. And it can work. Again, you might have a subject that kind of demands it, but generally speaking, as soon as you start getting into this type of framing, this isn't even as close as a traditional close-up could be, if you just keep your eye on here for a second, Amber. We're just starting to breach the top of the head here just a little bit. That kind of close-up, I see people jumping to that far too often. And for me, it serves no purpose in an interview, or very little purpose in an interview. Again, it's got to be motivated, but it's never going to go. This is never going to be my go-to framing for an interview, because if you think about it, in a drama, you're recreating a situation. Maybe it's a boyfriend, girlfriend, or you've got your protagonist in a situation where there's some kind of life-threatening thing going on, whatever it might be. In a drama, you'll see close-ups used a lot, but always with that build-in from the wide shot, establish the scene, move in, and then, we really want to see the emotion on their face. And that's a kind of a valid use of the close-up where you're in a situation that's completely false. You would never be able to be in a situation like that with that person. So it gives us the ability to see things that we wouldn't normally see. In an interview, it's far more mundane and everyday. So you're saying to your viewer, ideally, this is you just having a conversation with this person. Well, if I was having a conversation with Amber, to achieve this kind of, I don't even want to do it because it would just be so embarrassingly close. You would have to literally be that close to your subject to have this type of view of them. Why would you want to make your viewer feel like you're that far away from the CEO of, Wimpy? Where did Wimpy come from? That just came to the top of my head. Why would you want to necessarily convey that? Do we need to see the emotions in their eyes as they talk about the rise in profits over the last quarter? No, we don't care about that. So in the corporate world, in sort of most interviews, I think what's really nice is just to stick with a pretty classic medium close-up. Maybe establish the interview initially with a mid-shot or something like that. If there's a particularly interesting backdrop or the location where the interview is taking place is particularly relevant to the story, then you could maybe establish it with a nice wide shot and see what's going on around them, and then come into your medium close-up. And that's about planning your questions, making sure you run through them several times, or shooting with a multicam setup. Quite often I'll shoot with 2 cameras. It gives you a kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card in terms of editing, so you don't have to shoot lots and lots of B-roll. You've got something that you can cut to and avoid the dreaded jump cut. Any second camera should be a good sort of 30, 40 degrees off and closer or considerably further away. If it's too close and too similar, it'll feel like a jump cut as you cut between the two of them. But most editing packages now will automatically sync up cameras based on their audio. So as long as you've got some kind of top mic just gathering sync, you should be able to just click a button and it will synchronize those two up, and then you can cut back and forth between them in the edit. So it's something that I do. I think actually most of my interviews are now 2 camera. I tend to use the FS5, and then I've got an A7R, which I use for my second camera. So in terms of setting up this interview and lighting it and planning it and getting it lit and framed and everything, we're thinking constantly about what's the story, why is Amber here, what's she talking about, how can we create depth and create an engaging and dynamic image that people want to look at. And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the lighting is the importance of that eye light. I'm now actually slightly getting 2 eye lights, which is a little bit odd. But we can start to kind of experiment with where do we want an eye light. Now, the nice thing about eyes is they're incredibly reflective, very glossy surface, and so you can turn down your lights to almost nothing and still pick up that light. You can see as I pick that up and pull it down, this is now at 1%. So you can see the light picking up and going in Amber's eye. I can start to move that around and start to think about what can I do with this. So in the first instance, let's think about when would you not want an eye light? Can anyone think of any reason why you might not want an eye light for an interview, or a catch light as it's sometimes called? Anyone think of any examples? Think back to what we were just saying about narratively speaking. Yeah? Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So let's go back to my prisoner interview. He's just telling us that he's just got an extra 20 years put on his time in prison because he's just killed a guard or something, and we're sat there thinking, oh my God, what kind of person does this? And our conclusion is that someone soulless does this, someone with no conscience. And that that eye light or lack thereof can be a very simple and powerful way of saying to our viewer, this person is lacking that spark of life, that soul that would guide them away from killing someone, whatever it might be. We can also move our backlight and make it. Do you remember I said at the beginning about making it too top-heavy and catching the nose? Well, if stylistically we want to convey to the audience that someone is concealing something or they can't be trusted, another classic one is to top light that person, that character, and create big shadows that their brow casts underneath or across their eyes. If you take away the eye light and just left with these big dark wells of essentially nothing, there you can convey to the viewer that they're concealing something, that they don't want you to see their eyes because they don't want you to spot that they're telling some kind of lie or there's some kind of deception there. So the power of the eye light is vast, really, and you can make people feel certain ways. The shape of the reflection is also quite important. So do you want it to be a little pinprick of light, in which case use a very small, these neolights are great for getting a really small little pinprick of light in the corner of the eye. That can be a really powerful way of demonstrating innocence to someone and a kind of a slightly idealistic view of the world. If you want someone to come across as sort of homely and everyday and approachable, we use this trick I was doing a shoot for a company. I live out near Bath, and there's a nearby company who make basically Meals on Wheels for old people. It's a really exciting shoot, that one. But what was kind of interesting was the patron of this company is. Do you remember her? What happened to her? Well, that's what happened to her. She now sponsors Meals on Wheels and people like that. But what was interesting was we were shooting some stuff for them. We were showing her involved with the company, and they were like, we really want people to feel like it's this kind of friendly, kind of ruddy, kind of welcome in your home kind of thing. We even shot some scenes of her hand delivering these meals to some of these people in the local community. And for all of the interviews that we shot with her, we used a very large. So we used a key not dissimilar to a film not dissimilar to this, but we had a very large chimera or softbox attached to it. I mean, particularly big. So this one's good, but you can get huge ones. A big square chimera on it, just up in the top, and it created, and we just put some gaff, so black gaff tack or gaffer tape, just in a strip, just essentially across it, and it created this big soft window. And when you see big soft windows, eye lights in the corner of people's eyes, it makes you think of this sort of slightly homely, sat on your sofa at home watching the telly, the big windows in the corners of your eyes, and it creates a slightly more homely, domestic feel to the interview. So we could really play around with that idea. Dave, I'm reliant on you to give me warnings, by the way. Thanks. Let's talk about how this chart's going to help me then, because this is the more technical stuff. So this is lit how we want it. We're happy with that. The next thing that I want my subject to do is to hold up my chart. So this is just a big version of the smaller one that Adrian showed earlier. This is specifically for video. So this is the Color Checker video target. It's got much less on it, but what is there is far more pertinent to filmmaking. And again, we have a grey balanced side as well. And just to add, there was something that I wanted to add actually. So when Adrian was talking about this, so we talked about the grey allowing you to sample from an area which isn't going to be clipped. Another very important point about these, because I'm sure you get this as well, Adrian, I constantly get asked by people, can't I just use a white tablecloth or a white shirt? And yes, there's the clipping argument, but then what I get, and I don't know if you get this, is people say, I'll just stop it down a bit so the white tablecloth is not clipping. And you're like, The other crucial thing about this is that it's spectrally flat, which sounds really impressive. But all it means is this is made at a level of a kind of excellence, if you like. The way that they've produced this is such that there is guaranteed to be no pigments in this material whatsoever. Now, pigments absorb frequencies of light. If you have a pigment in this, even if it's not one that your eyes can see, if it's there, the frequencies of light will be being absorbed by that pigment and therefore not reflected back to your camera that you're then white balancing from in camera. And so your white balance will be just wrong. Thank you, Dave. Your white balance will just be plain old wrong. And I again, if I had the time, I would demonstrate this very quickly. If I just got a white piece of paper, stopped it down a bit so it wasn't clipping, made sure it wasn't clipping and white balance from it, and then did it from something spectrally flat, you would see immediately big differences in the results. So it's also about that pigment-free surface, which actually our eyes are terrible at seeing detail, particularly in those lighter colors and those highlights. And so we look at that white tablecloth and it is always going to look white to us. But there could be huge amounts of contamination of blue pigment, for example, which are incredibly insensitive to blue anyway. So we're never going to see it, but a camera will. And in fact, what's really nice about these Sonys, particularly DSLRs, is they will show you not only the Kelvin that they'll pick up off of one of these grey balance cards, they'll even show you how much green or magenta they've added in. So if you're doing it in like a dodgy office with dodgy office fluoros, you'll see there'll be a little bit of magenta added in to pull out the green. So it's a really very quick way of seeing it doing its work. So I would get my subject to hold that as uncomfortably close to their face as they can. I need to, as best as possible, fill the camera with this. So the temptation is to move it over here. The light over here is not the light that's falling on my subject, so it would be wrong for me to white balance from a chart that's not where my subject is. And too often people kind of forget that these things can oh so easily come off their tripod. The tripod is set up, it's not going to move unless I kick it. Now the HDMI cable is going to fall out, so I'm just going to pull that out before it does it on me. And I can move over here, fill the screen, one press of a button, and that's come up at 3,300 Kelvin. It's as simple as that. That's now done, and I can plonk that back on my tripod. Get this back in so you can see it. And there we go. So that's now white balanced properly. Another little trick, if you are using an on-camera monitor, you can get up the RGB parade, and you can look at your red, green, and blue channels side by side. And a grey target like that will stand out like a sore thumb. There'll be a flat line in the middle of your image. It's very easy to spot on the scopes. And if they're all level, you know that it's balanced. You can actually, if you're in a hurry and you can't get the camera close to your grey balance card, you can use that as a cheat, basically, to white balance it internally in camera. The next thing then, if we just turn it around, thank you very much, that's it, perfect. We can then use this to judge our exposure. The way that you would want to do this, and I've actually turned my menus on so you can see as I go through, is I would want to make sure that my zebras, so I'm going to turn on my zebras. There's two zebras in most cameras. Zebra 1 is a plus minus, normally 5%, so it will show you broadly the area you're in. Whereas Zebra 2 is a very specific setting where it will trigger as soon as it hits a very specific value, which is what we want, because that top white chip in the middle there is specifically 90% reflectance. Now, 90% reflectance is a pretty industry standard way of describing the white point for most gamma curves. It changes, so you may or may not know about things like S-log3, S-log2, C-log. Doesn't matter if you do or not. They are ways of manipulating your camera to change the gamma curve, and it will change that 90% reflectance value. And if you know what they are, you can use this. So even if you're shooting in log, you can still use this chart. So for example, I've just changed it from 61%, where it was set up for S-log3, when obviously the last time I used this camera. It's 59% for S-log2. So if you know the values, you can actually plumb them in. So I've gone to 90 because I'm using a Rec 709 gamma curve. And you can see there's no zebra. So as I open up the lens, there you go, we're just starting to get some zebras now appearing. So that's stopped down. That's stopped up. In fact, I'm now at the maximum 1.8, so if I wanted to change from there, I'd need to start messing around with the eye. So it's close enough for me to not want to do that. But that tells me that this is perfectly exposed, because if that 90% reflectance is now got zebras on it, which should only come on at 90%, it's simple. It can't not be exposed properly. So I can get my image exposed very quickly and simply in that way. The other thing I can do if I then record a few seconds of this is I can then take that in as just a few seconds into post, and it becomes my chart. Thank you, Dave. It becomes my chart to then do the whole balance. Now, it's not quite so important when you're shooting Rec 709. It's very easy to adjust. But actually, this black value will be incredibly high if you're shooting log, and you can plot that on your waveform monitor and put it where it needs to go. And this is some of the stuff that I'm going to show you in the next session. Very quickly, because I've completely forgotten about it. Mic placement, you'll notice the mic is where it should be. It's just slightly out of frame, above my subject, pointing down. It's not pointing at her mouth, it's actually pointing across. So I'm actually placing where she's projecting her voice right into the middle of the pickup pattern of the microphone. So these boom mics, which are great for these sorts of interviews, you can get them, because the top of the frame is tight up against the head, you can get them very close, within sort of 12 inches, the sweet spot of your subject. Pick up the perfect pattern and place the pattern here and their voice projecting into it. And what you're looking for in terms of level, you'll see little audio meters peaking up. What you want is for them to be peaking, so the loudest they get, to be -6 dB. That's the sweet spot. That's where you want your audio levels for dialogue to be hitting, and that's where you want them when you're outputting them. So if you can record them in camera where you want them, like exposure and white balance, it means you have to do a lot less later on. So I'm running over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have people come up to me and ask questions now. And we've got a 15-minute break, and then I'll be back. I've slightly overrun, apologies for that. But come and ask me any questions you've got.